Thanks, Ivy. Hi, I'm your host for today. I'm Terry Tolan. For those of you who may not have known me, I've had a 23-year United Way career, 3 local United Ways, and 15 years as the CEO of United Way of Kentucky. And I am currently a member of the United Way Next Board of Directors and co-chair of the Engage and Exchange Committee, which recommends the programming for these virtual sessions. So I'm delighted to be here as host and particularly happy to be with my former colleague, Brook Manville, our speaker for today. Brook was Executive Vice President at United Way of America from 2003 to 2008, while I was at United Way of Kentucky. And so I've been happy to have this opportunity to connect with him again, and work with him on facilitating this session. For those of you who didn't know Brook during his United Way tenure, Brook is now an independent consultant. He writes mostly about politics. He was also in his earlier career a partner with McKinsey and Company, CBS, colleague, and Saba Software Company. So he's done a lot of different things, a lot of different hats. United Way probably being the most surprising one. Brook has written extensively. He's the author of several books and articles, mostly about citizenship and democracy. And when he offered to do sessions based on his newest book, The Civic Bargain, How Democracy Survives, we were delighted to be able to bring him to United Way Next members for some learning about democracy and some lively discussion as well. The Civic Bargain, How Democracy Survives, was named Best Book of 2023 by the New Yorker magazine. So it's indeed an honor to have him with us. But before I turn it over to him, we'd like to learn a little bit about you and your views about democracy today. So Ivy, if you will help us, we're going to do a few poll questions and you'll have about a minute to answer questions and we'll track them as they go along. So go ahead and select your answers to these questions. Overall, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the way democracy is working in this country? What is the single best thing Americans could do to strengthen today's democracy? And third is to declare your own party leanings, affiliations. So if you just click the box and submit your answer.
And it looks like we're getting a couple of answers already. It looks like we're at 4 of 14, so keep on submitting. And if you just entered the room, we are currently running a poll for all of the attendees. And it looks like we've got 60% participation so far. And just a reminder that all of them are anonymous, so you don't have to worry about sharing anything personal. We won't know who said what. And we've got 73% participated. If anyone else has a couple more answers that they want to put in the next 30 seconds, maybe the poll will have been live for 2 minutes. We're up to 80%.
Okay, let's see who we are.
Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and share the results for you guys. Let me know if you can see them. It looks like for question number 1, 83% of individuals answered that they are generally dissatisfied, and 17% answered they are somewhere in between. The single best thing Americans can do to strengthen today's democracy. I will try to see if I can give you more of the answers all in one space. The answers are all kind of spread out. It looks like the only one that people didn't select was improve foreign security. And then for the last one, it looks like it was an even split. 50% of individuals are Democrat and 50% are independent or other.
No Republicans in this group, I guess. All right, Brooke. Well, so that's who you're talking to. We'll turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Terry, and thanks to United Way Next and Carol and all of you who helped pull this thing together with me. I'm delighted to see many old friends and colleagues. Others I don't know, but I'm honored that you want to come and listen in. I thought it'd be very valuable to share some of my thoughts about this new book that I wrote with Josh Ober from Stanford University, who's been a longtime friend. Um, because United Way has, when I first joined United Way, one of the motivations for me was that United Way has been a source in its community building and volunteer work of creating and sustaining civic values, I'll say, or democratic values across our nation for hundreds of years. And I think it's very important to sort of make a connection with the mission of United Way, or part of the mission of United Way, with some of the thinking that we've been doing and others are doing about democracy writ large. So I think this is a great opportunity. I hope you will take something positive from it, and I'm looking forward to a conversation. Let me get started here. I have to share my screen, and how does that look? Ivy, are we there?
Looks great.
Okay, so everybody can see then. All right, I'm going to speak for about maybe 40 minutes and then open it up for questions and comments. Oops, sorry. So I want to start off with some ground rules. You know, the air is very fraught these days with political opinions and antagonism and whatnot, and I want to take advantage of the historical study that I did to provide you with some deeper background. I want to get it, I don't want to focus on today's headlines, at least not right away. I want to focus on the history and background of democracy as we researched it in our book. And hopefully that will help you gain some deeper and wider perspective about what's going on with democracy and what could be done for those of you who see that there are problems. And I think most of you do, and I share that. Opinions are fine. We're going to keep it civil. I think everybody here is civil already, so I'm not too worried about that. But just as a general point, this is not a partisan harangue. It's a discussion, and my presentation, I hope, will be as nonpartisan as possible, which is my intent. And certainly, those of you who read the book, I hope would see the same. I'm happy to say, by the way, our book has been reviewed and often discussed with Republican groups as well as Democratic groups, and we've always had very positive feedback. We have so far escaped the notion that this is, you know, a partisan story. So we begin with Mr. Ober and I got going on this book during the COVID. Actually, we wrote it together over Zoom during COVID because the air was already being filled with rhetoric about the death of democracy. There was a well-known book that came out about democracy's dying. People were talking about it. And, you know, it's now kind of a cliche. Falling trust. I mean, our little poll actually maps pretty closely to what the Pew Charitable Trust and others do. Like 70 or 80% of Americans are now disappointed about what our democracy has become, or lack trust in it, or lack some degree in trust of it. Polarization is just in the headlines every day. We don't need to dwell on that. We see it, the power struggles and the gridlock. There's so little legislation being passed, and even passing a budget and things like that is increasingly hard to do because of the partisan standoffs. And through the last several years, lots of analysts have come forward, books have been written, I kind of group the commentary and the books in around, three big bubbles. Um, the most common, or one of the most noisy, if you like, is, well, we just have to get the right party in power and kill off the other side, and then everything's going to be fine. Um, the somewhat more detached suggestions are that we need to, I call it rewiring the machine. Different books or articles are written about people saying we have to change the Electoral College or get rid of it. We have to undo gerrymandering. The Supreme Court needs to be bigger, needs to be smaller, needs to be full of more intelligent people. I mean, lots of different articles are written. And then that's lots about congressional reform. Some of these are partisan harangues, others are more analytical perspectives, but they're all about changing the institutions and the processes. Um, and then there's a number of people who write books which, by my view, sort of what I call reinvent the dream. You get a lot of often Republican treatises about, we have to get rid of the deep state. That's the real problem in democracy. Other people say, we have to be more like, places like Norway or Sweden, where everybody supposedly gets along with each other and is harmonious. That's actually not completely true, but and then there's a lot of focus on equality, that we have to end economic equality, and then everything will be wonderful once again. Um, I mean, there are elements of truth in all of these, except perhaps this notion of achieving tribal victory. I mean, there are things that clearly would help, but we think overall that they're too narrow in general, and certainly this notion of achieving tribal victory is ultimately adversarial in a rather negative way, as I think I'll explain further. So when we wrote our book, we sort of listened to a lot of this, and we began to talk with one another. We've been friends and colleagues for many years, Mr. Ober and I. And we said, what we really need to do is change the conversation. We need to suspend the kind of the cheering and the trench warfare for one side or the other. We need to go back and take advantage of history and really widen the aperture, to look back and reframe the question in a more neutral and, we think, constructive way. So what we did is we wanted to kind of return to what we called the fundamentals. Um, Instead of saying, well, democracy is dying, woe is us, what are we going to do? Or even more particularly, how do we beat the other side and for once and for all make this, a democratic kingdom or a Republican kingdom or whatever? We said, let's instead kind of take a wellness approach. Let's say, what actually keeps democracy alive? And the theory is, if we could do that, everybody would win. And why can't we take that more positive approach? And let's use history to pursue that question. So we look back at what we called the four great democracies of Western civilization. These used to be textbook examples. They've been sort of under a cloud to some degree because of the cancel culture in the past. But the fact of the matter is that if you look back to the antiquity of ancient, particularly classical Athens, um, the Roman Republic before Rome became an empire, but it was a republic for hundreds of years. The British parliamentary system is an established and long-lasting democracy, and of course our own American democracy, which is still alive and kicking, as troubled as it may be. Each of these four cases are well-documented stories of democracy with a lot of evidence about what they did, how they made democracy work, and they all lasted as pretty well-functioning democracies for at least a couple of centuries, if not more. And so we said, look, there's a body of well-known examples that if you bring the wellness perspective to them and say, look, the ancient ones eventually fell, they declined, yes, but they lasted a long time, and the two modern ones have been going for quite a long time as well. What can we learn from that? So that was the sort of the methodology of the book. And we asked these very fundamental questions. Let's go back to sort of the basics. So what actually is democracy? I mean, if you're worried about keeping it alive, what are you trying to keep alive? What is it that is the essential nature of what democracy is? Where did it come from? How did it actually arise? Again, looking back in history. And then for these cases where hundreds of years was a long enduring run, what actually kept it going? Can we find some, ghost in the machine that can explain why they were able to hang on as long as they did? And then, of course, okay, so what? What are the lessons that we might want to take about that for today? So I want to go through these 4 questions as a way of organizing our thoughts today. If you've read the book, you'll recognize much of what follows, but a lot of what's here is a more simplified and hopefully accessible version for the purpose of a 45-minute presentation. So first of all, what is democracy? How do we define it? Part of the problem about figuring out how to fix democracy is agreeing what it is you want if you're successful. And people have a lot of different ideas. If you stop man on the street, like Jay Leno used to do, so what is democracy? You'd get a lot of different answers. I threw up some in these bubbles here. Some of these you may be familiar with, others maybe not so much. A lot of it is about freedom, preserving freedom in a some people say it has to be a big, caring government. Other people say, no, it has to be as small as possible, but freedom is at the core. There's people make the distinction between a republic and the mob rule of ancient democracies. A lot of people want to focus on things like welfare. The welfare state is what liberal democracy is about, and it should be run by experts, people who really know what they're doing. Others drift more towards, to use a euphemism, strong leadership. They want strong leadership that's supported by the people, but the leader has a lot of prerogative of what to do. That would be, their idea of democracy. Economic equality is a major theme. Some people say the biggest problem to solve is that we have such a wide disparity of income and financial wealth in this country. And other people lean more towards, sort of the human rights of all people deserve a certain level of care and concern. We should be a caring community from sea to shining sea and welcome all people. And of course, this runs into some of the antagonism we get about the borders and whatnot these days. But all of these are plausible answers, but they end up bringing you a pretty different place in terms of, well, what would you do to get there? And so that's a big part of the problem. We have to get to some kind of fundamental basic agreement about what it is. So I don't know if everybody will agree, but we said, look, if we're going to strip it down to the most basic thing, and if we're going to go back to Aristotle, who's always a safe touchstone to reach out to, Aristotle basically said democracy is self-governance by citizens. Citizens basically making the decisions and looking after themselves as a community of members of a polis, a Greek polis. But the essence was self-governance by citizens. So we simplified this even further. We have this kind of catchy phrase in the book. We say, look, you can call it, you can use fancy language, but it's really, at the end of the day, it's like, we don't want a boss. It's like living together with no boss. And, you can put lots of different bad examples in the pictures. I chose Vladimir Putin and, Henry VIII and mafia bosses and what like that. But basically any kind of a boss, an oligarch, a single leader, an oligarchy of a narrow elite, military junta, when you have that, you don't have democracy. That's as simple as we got. And we said, let's use kind of Occam's razor. Let's keep it as simple as that. Now you notice in my little graphic here, I have an asterisk. And the asterisk, I like to say, is not incidental. Because what our book really comes out to say is it's living with no boss except one another, which is you have to understand that if you're going to live with no boss, you're going to have a democracy, you are going to have a sort of a boss, which is the other citizens. Aristotle famously said that living in a democracy is learning how to both rule and be ruled. Now, one of the many dilemmas that you run into when you start to peel back the onion of democracy is that people hate having a boss, but they also need a boss. Um, if you've ever been on a project or, like somebody has to create a new line of a product or something, or even something simple, like let's have a company picnic on Memorial Day. And somebody pipes up and says, I don't think anybody should be leading this. I think we should just plain do it democratically. If you ever had that experience, you know what usually happens. It turns into a disaster, right? And because it's very hard to get a large group of people, or even a sort of smallish but significant group of people to agree on something. And that is the challenge of democracy. It's easier to have a boss. You don't have to kind of argue. You just have to kind of do it. Now, there's lots of disadvantages about having a boss, of course, but bosses help around the core dilemma of getting stuff done. So to make this kind of conceptually, we say, look, democracy is really hard, and I think we underestimate that it's a difficult, almost unnatural way for people to act at any kind of scale. You have to solve these kinds of questions. How do we achieve collective action without some boss commanding us what to do? How do we act together without being compelled to think alike? How do we keep our individual freedoms but still get stuff done as a group? I mean, this is what makes democracy hard. It's also what makes it wonderful, because you get to think what you want. You have some freedom. You don't have to worry about some boss, breathing down your neck, sending you to El Salvador. It has its advantages, but it's hard. It's hard to make work. And that's, I think, one of the big ahas that we came across in our book, that we knew it, but we wanted to kind of stress it. Democracy is hard, and it works if you somehow figure out how to address these dilemmas. So the punchline, of course, is coming. How do you do that? You make a deal. You make a deal with the other citizens. If you're going to work together without a boss, if you're not going to be have the easiness of being told what to do, then you have to make some sort of understandings. How are we going to do this as a team? How are we going to do this as a group? You have to face questions like, who's us? What are our common goals? How are we going to make decisions? How do we resolve conflicts? And how do we treat each other so that this agreement stays alive? So conceptually, just to knit these ideas that I've been throwing at you together, we say that, no boss begins with Aristotle's idea that it's citizens governing themselves. And what makes that work are certain rules and norms that we negotiate and maintain to govern ourselves as free equals. And that's what we call the civic bargain. So our book is called The Civic Bargain. The big idea is, if you really strip down the essence of what democracy is and what allows it to work, it's that there's a sort of civic bargain, as we call it, a sort of agreement about how we're going to work together. And I like to compare this in a sort of analogy. I know Mike Durkin loves baseball, so I put in a baseball slide here. If you play baseball, there are certain rules and norms by which we agree to play. It's not about who won the World Series. It's not going to be which pitcher do we want to have, in the ninth inning or anything. It's before we even get to any of those questions, when we even start playing, it's like, look, we're going to play with certain rules. 3 strikes are out. They're going to have 3 bases. If you get caught between the bases and tagged, you're out, and so on and so forth. There's just basic rules. So we're really working on the rules and also the norms, the informal attributes of behavior, if you like, that make the game work the way they work. And the same thing can be said about democracy. Now, if you read our book, we get down into a next level of detail. We say, look, there's a lot of different things that go into making what we call a civic bargain, or making democracy, self-governance as citizens work. But we wanted to highlight 7, which we think are sort of the most essential. The first one is that everybody agrees, whatever we're going to do, we're going to make sure we don't end up being told by one person as our boss what to do. No boss, except one another, right? The reason that we come together as a nation or a community is that we are better together to provide some level of basic security. You know, we're as opposed to going it on our own if we get attacked or invaded or you know, hurricanes come or whatnot, we're better if there's some level of agreement that we will work together to fix the problem of the hurricane or ward off the invaders. It's just sort of common sense of human organizations. And similarly, that we're gonna work together to maintain that there's some level of welfare. Doesn't mean everybody gets, lifetime income. It doesn't mean that everybody has health care from cradle to grave necessarily, but there's some level of basic human welfare. And everybody who works in United Way understands this intimately, of course. There's a level of human welfare for human dignity that is necessary in order to allow people to go on and be citizens in the community. So our third one is citizenship itself. We need to get very clear who is and who isn't a citizen and what citizenship means. In other words, if we're building a community with no boss, we have to ask, who's us? Right? You know, who's us who's not going to have a boss? And what does it mean to be one of us? It's like being a member in a club. You know, if you join a club, you have certain membership requirements and you get certain privileges. You know, that's what membership in a club is. So it's like membership in a club that comes along with the deal, with the civic bargain. The institutions that we need for making decisions, for resolving conflicts, the courts, the legislature, so on, those have to be citizen-led. We can't say, look, I'm too busy, just hire somebody to do it. Citizens must be at some level engaged, or those officials must be accountable in some way to the citizens. And then we get into these things that are a little bit softer, but very important. Good faith negotiation. I mean, if you are making a deal to avoid having a boss, it means that you're going to have to deal with lots of people with lots of different opinions about almost everything. There's no way to move ahead without sometimes agreeing to make some kind of compromise. And that the spirit of being a member of a democracy is, you know, it's important to do this because this is what allows us to work together. Doesn't mean you always win. In fact, it means you usually don't always win. But you go into the debates, the discussions, the challenges saying, okay, I'm going to give it my best shot, but I would not be surprised if maybe I don't get my way completely. But that's just part of being, that's kind of the price of being in a democracy. It's the cost of going along for the bargain. And then we talk about civic friendship, which is actually a concept in Aristotle. And it's kind of a complicated idea in some ways, in the sense that a lot of people think, oh, this means we have to always agree with one another, that we have to get consensus. It doesn't mean that. And it doesn't even mean that you have to have warm and, intimate friendships with other people. It means that you know how to get along with people. Now, those of you, all of you who've worked in United Way and local United Ways, you understand that, you have to bring lots of people in the local community together. Some of them are going to be a little bit of a pain to deal with. Some of them are going to be great. Some of them are going to be people you want to go to a baseball game with, others not so much. But you just get along because you're all working on the same thing. You're all trying to make the community better. And civic friendship is important because the deals are going to get harder and more conflicted from time to time. And you want to preserve the relationship so that if something doesn't work, you can go back and say, hey, I know we agreed last week that we're going to do it this way. It's not working. Can we try it again? If you've burned the bridge, if you've exploded the relationship because you hate that other person, they're not going to talk to you. It's not going to happen. And so again, we think that's an important thing. And then lastly, civic education, that you need to bring people into the swim, the next generation of the values, the ideas, the concepts, such as these, and that they are educated to understand what they must do as citizens when they grow and they become of age. Now, all these things are perhaps intuitively obvious, but we drew them out of some combination of democratic theory. There's plenty of that written. But most importantly, you find versions of this in every one of our case studies. So it's based in fact of what people actually have done in history in building democracies. You can find, versions or examples of these 7 things being worked on as part of the life of the democracy in Athens, in Rome, in Great Britain, and the United States. And so we think we're getting to, again, the kind of the wellness model, wellness people in different parts of the world. People know that if you exercise, you live longer. If you eat certain kinds of food, you tend to live longer. If you stay out of very dangerous situations, you tend to live longer, right? So there's some basic principles, and these are basic principles that are observable in these 4 kind of benchmark cases. And they essentially are the underpinning or the undercarriage of the civic bargain. Okay, so how did democracy actually arise? Again, looking at these 4 cases, what does the history tell us? And the reason we wanted to focus on the origins is, like human life or actually biological life itself, the stages that the creatures go through to become mature often tell you a lot about, what makes it work. And so we wanted to say, how did these civic bargains actually come together? Where did they come from? And to what degree can we find these essential conditions in actual living color, looking back at history? So the thinking that I'm inviting you to share here is involves a little bit of changing of thinking. If you've studied history, and if you look back in the history of democracy in textbooks, if you did it in high school or college, the major emphasis tends to be sort of revolution. It was the democratic moment was power to the people. No more boss. So we study in our high school textbooks, Bunker Hill, the Boston Tea Party, the throwing off of the bonds of the king. In Athens, there was an overthrow in Rome as well, and in Britain too, as I'll get into. That's an important moment. But we say we need to pay much more attention to sort of what happens after you've broken away. So if you think about going from the American Revolution to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and after the war is basically won, it was an oh my God moment. We're now on our own. What are we going to do? We have to actually work together and often disagree about how we're going to govern ourselves. People can rally around a George Washington and say, nothing's better than freedom. Sign me up. But after you win the freedom, then it's now what do we do? And it's that moment after the revolution, after the turning point, if you like, that is in many ways the most important to understand where democracy comes from. Because that's how this idea of the bargain is actually put together and crafted. Our Constitution was, in fact, a huge bargain unto itself. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So that shift of focus from breaking from the boss to building a boss-free community that works is the critical transition. So if you've read the book, the stories about the 4 democracies. We detailed it with some level of facts and background. This is just a very thin placeholder if you've not read the book or may help you remember if you've read the book. In Athens, the kind of the transition moment of breaking free from a boss, which was essentially a tyrannical leader, was in 508 BC, just before the beginning of the Golden Age. It ushered in the Golden Age. As a matter of fact, a man named Cleisthenes took the radical idea. He was fighting with fellow aristocrats over who was going to take over once they got rid of the tyrant. And he had this bold idea. He said, you know what, I'm going to just turn to everybody who's around, who's standing around in the streets and invite them to be part of the government. That was a very radical idea. And it was from that that the whole concept of citizenship was defined, system of people voting in assemblies, courts. I mean, it took years to develop all that, but it came out of that moment, and the building of the bargain is what followed. Rome was originally ruled by kings. The kings were thrown out in 509, but the group of oligarchs of major aristocratic families basically took over and became the Senate. And so early Rome, even though the kings were gone, was still sort of a boss-led place ruled by a Senate. And the soldiers who were fighting in the armies at some point had enough and said, you know, we're not going to fight in the army anymore unless you give us more say in the future of Roman policy making. And they went on strike. And there were a series of strikes. And finally in 287, the Senate caved in and said, all right, we're going to give you your own assembly, your own magistrates, and the laws that you propose are going to be just as eligible for the laws of the land as the laws that come out of the Senate. So that was a major turning point. And from that, the Roman Republic, with multiple different assemblies and courts, and people being participative, and officials being voted by people who were citizens, all that grew out of that strike moment. Britain was ruled by kings for centuries. A major turning point was around the end of the 17th century, 1688, when the Parliament and the king had come to such odds that one faction in Parliament invited a interloper, William of Orange, to invade and take over and become the new king. And out of that grew a much more robust and extensive parliamentary system that started to marginalize the role of the king, and the democracy grew from that over the next 2 centuries. The American Revolution is all known to you probably better than these others. It began after the victory in the American Revolution, and then the founders started to put together our Constitution in the famous Philadelphia Convention. And that had to be done through lots of compromises, and then it had to be ratified. The Federalist Papers were published, which engaged people across the 13 colonies to decide if they were willing to accept this new civic bargain, as it were. And from that, of course, our democracy became established. So I've told you a little bit already about why bargaining is such a valuable concept for thinking about democracy. But I want to just kind of stress it, drive the point home a little bit, because again, it's something that I think everybody sort of knows. You may not have connected it to your ideas about democracy, but let me help you do that now. I mean, first of all, bargaining is part of everybody's human nature. Kids learn it sometimes the hard way in nursery school, in school, that, you know, you have to learn to take turns and make agreements about, you know, who's going to get to be, you know, first in line at resource, and that then rotates. Through business and, of course, nonprofit work, people develop partnerships. They create bargains to understand who's going to do what, who's responsible. And if anybody's ever been married or have a partnership of some personal sort, you know, bargaining with a partner or a spouse is part of how you get along and survive. And through human history, what's interesting is, I'm going to introduce you to some of this now, that all of these civic bargains actually grew out of what we call political bargains, not civic, but political bargains between people who were stronger and less strong. And so the whole notion of learning how to govern ourselves actually has roots in people learning how to get along with, in a somewhat more democratic way, people with greater power. And so bargains can be helpful even if power is unequal, because, you know, you can improve your lot. Bargaining can be better than fighting or going to war or having pure anarchy. So it may not always be completely just, but when people find a way to get together and make some kind of a bargain about how they're going to work together, good things can happen. So again, in our book, if you've dipped into it, you can learn about this. This is a very, very small summary. In the case of Athens, the Democratic Revolution of 508 had been basically brewing for hundreds of years, almost 100 years before. As one famous example, there was civil war about to break out between the rich people and the poor people who were working the land. Uh, and a well-known statesman called Solon stepped in, and he basically said, look, instead of killing each other, let's make a bargain, bring our small nation together, because by the way, we're about to be invaded by the Spartans and a couple of other neighboring cities. Let's just agree that you'll have a little bit of say in decision making, you poor people. Rich people, you're not gonna be able to enslave the poor people anymore, but we're not going to redistribute the land. So there was a bargain that was struck that kind of brought peace, and that set the tone that later, when people were wanting to govern themselves fully as citizens, they already had some experience that bargaining between powerful and less powerful could be helpful. The same thing happened in the Roman situation, the soldier strikes that I mentioned, which reached a turning point in 287, actually stretched back over 100 years. They went on strike many, many times. And each time they went on strike, the Senate and the aristocrats basically said, all right, we understand that you don't want to fight without having a little say in the government. They would give them a small say, and then another 20 years would go by and they'd go on strike again and they get a little bit more. So over time, the bargain evolved into more and more of a bargain amongst equals, and that then became a civic bargain, as we call it. In Britain, I mentioned a turning point in 1688. But as far back as the 13th century, there was this deal struck between several of the nobles and the king, King John, which created the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, which you've probably heard of, was the first time that was set down in paper where everybody in England, whether they were the lowest serfs or the most senior members of the nobility, would start to have certain basic rights. I mean, they still had to honor the king, but there were certain basic rights about what became trial by jury, about that people couldn't have their land seized without some kind of discussion amongst members of the community and that kind of thing. So the Magna Carta, which is, enshrined as the birth of democracy, it wasn't really the birth of democracy, but it was the birth of the idea of some of the things that became later full British citizenship. So again, the idea that there were bargains that were less than full equality that started to set the tone and set the ideas in motion, that you can make deals with people that can lead to more and more freedom and equality over time. And of course, in the United States case, for those of you who studied your American history, you know that even before the American Revolution, Britain basically made a de facto bargain with each of our colonies. We, the American colonists, were allowed to have houses of burgesses and simple colonial legislatures to manage our local affairs. The Brits said, if you want to argue amongst yourselves about the price of onions locally, that's okay with us. And they were allowed to do certain basic things locally with a level of freedom and participative decision making that set the tone for what later went into the full-blown Constitution later. Okay, so now we turn to the question of what is it that's kept democracy going? How do we keep civic bargains alive and strong? We know they've grown out of deals. We know they've grown out of earlier bargains. But what allowed them to keep evolving and keep moving towards that notion of freedom and equality? Well, the basic idea is that civic bargains, and again, the history shows us, have to be continuously renewed. So what we believed in, 1789 had to keep evolving and being changed in order to be pertinent and relevant. Same thing in Athens. You see the system of courts and the system of of magistracies changing and evolving over time, and in Republican Rome and in Britain. So this whole notion that there's an evolution, an ongoing development that has to be done in order to keep democracy alive is central to the thesis of our book. And as one of our reviewers said, what you're really saying is that democracy is never done. So, just turning momentarily to our current situation, I mean, if you're depressed about what's going on, um, understand that there's a chance, in fact, a need to keep it alive by continuing to evolve, continuing to renew it, to continuing to change. We can't just say, well, this is a violation of what James Madison said, and the Supreme Court will decide, and then we're done with it. Well, it's not that simple. That the world is different. We have different enemies. We have different groups of populations that we deal with. We're much bigger than we used to be. We have technology. We have new ways of working, some of which are harmful to the population, some of which have changed things for the better. And so our civic bargain has to evolve with our democracy has to grow as we ourselves evolve as a nation to decide what we want to be. So if you can use our 7 conditions as like a little scorecard, or a little sort of map. If you think back about how have civic bargains been renewed through history or changed? Well, in the case of no boss, we have term limits now. We didn't used to have term limits for our presidency. We have checks and balances. Those are being tested a lot right now, of course, but they are nonetheless increasingly refined. We have challenges, we have protests. Security and welfare, we've had to evolve, things about military service, about the alliances that we have, the social programs that we didn't used to have. Medicare, we have Medicare now. We didn't used to have income tax. We have income tax now. So, we are continuing to adapt to needs for security and welfare in order to keep ourselves free. Our citizenship through history has been, in some cases, looser, in some cases, tighter. Of course, there's been all this storming about the border. The border is being fortified now. The whole notion of duties and rights continue to evolve about what different groups should be allowed to do or not allowed to do. That's all part of citizenship. Citizen institutions have been amended and revised, and there's all different pieces of law about that. Through compromise, right now we don't see a whole lot of compromise in our political culture, but there have been many times of great compromise, and we've learned from those. I mean, the Marshall Plan was a huge compromise after World War II. The GI Bill, the civil rights legislation was a compromise. So we're capable of compromise historically. We have known it, and it's part of what has kept us going, I would argue. Civic friendship, also much troubled today, but we have had in our past great solidarity and issues and eras of ambition. Those of you old enough to remember what it felt like to be in America during the Kennedy years, there was a whole lot more civic friendship then. There was a lot of civic friendship after World War II. After 9/11, there was a feeling of much more share and share alike attitudes. So we're capable of doing it. We just have to remember that it's valuable and why it matters. And civic education. We talk about civic education not just in terms of schools, but also in things like what people learn when they go into military service, through public rituals. The 4th of July, properly done, is a form of civic education. We read books about great heroes that we are to emulate, and so on and so forth. So we know how to do all these things. We have been renewing. We in America, you can find examples of all this kind of change and renewal in each of the case studies. I don't have time to go into them today, but the core idea is you can see that democracy is an evolution and constant source of continuous improvement in the best possible case. When we can affect that, then the democracy will indeed survive.
And Brooke, I just want to make one quick comment while you are switching slides.
Yeah,
Just to honor everyone's time, I know that we do have about another 20 or so minutes, but just in case any of you guys have to hop off before the Q&A, I do want to let you know that you are more than welcome to drop your questions into the chat now, and then we will make sure to answer them or at least bring them up and give them to Brooke, and then you guys can check out the answers in the recording. And if you guys do hop off early, there will be a 3-question survey just at the end of the Zoom meeting that just helps us do a better job at providing the best events that we can for you guys. And just to shout out part 2 on April 30th. So I will hand it back over to Brooke, but just in case anyone needed to hop off, I wanted to get that out there.
thank you, Ivy. And that's a great reminder that I need to sort of wrap this up, which I will do now. The recording is worth listening to. If you want to go back and think about some of this, I'm going fairly quickly. But again, it's a companion to the book, and you may find it useful to think about further. So democracy in America today, if we said our 7 conditions is kind of like a scorecard, how are we doing? And I'll just go pretty quickly here. No boss. I mean, yeah, boss is in the headlines, of course, today, but there's lots of Americans who basically in polling say, democracy is not the best form of government. We should have leaders who break rules. Some of our fellow Americans even say it's okay to resort to political violence to get things done. So, within our own ranks, not everybody believes that no boss is still worth pursuing as a condition of democratic survival. Security and welfare, our enemies are getting stronger and they're pulling together more and more, which is very frightening. Domestically, we have lots of problems that I don't have to rehearse for you, whether it's inequality, property crimes, homelessness. I mean, there's real questions whether or not we are providing the level of basic welfare that we need to. And of course, that's a major policy discussion. Citizenship, I think that all of the political fighting about the border is symbolic of the larger question of what is citizenship? If people come in illegally and have essentially all the rights of citizens except for the one of voting, I mean, are we preserving what citizenship means? Some people would say, yes, we are. There's the whole antagonism around identity politics and DEI. Well, there are reasons to embrace people of different backgrounds and races and whatnot, but historically, when you start to segment people off into special categories of treatment, you start to weaken the notion of the common framework and the common good of democracy. And so that's been a point of stress for us that's come out in our political debates. Our citizen institutions are under much debate today, whether or not the Supreme Court should be bigger, whether or not we need to have more representatives, whether or not our voting, many Americans don't believe our voting processes are secure. I mean, that's an ideological fraught question, unfortunately. Good faith negotiation. Unfortunately, our legislative processes have become more like political theater, where people, are more worried about, engaging their Twitter followers than actually getting something done. Real leaders don't compromise. Mike Pence famously said that. And the extremists tend to be the tail wagging the dog in many of our decisions. And compromise is not considered, noble in any way. Civic friendship, lots of bad things get said about each other, which shouldn't be said. You might say they're justified, but we have a climate that is just so damn, adversarial. Long term, it will destroy us, and it's just something we got to fix. Civic education. I mean, there are all sorts of statistics you can quote. It's frightening. I mean, all these kids who barely know what the Declaration of Independence are, have never been in a debate. Adults as well as kids can't name 3 branches of government. This is a huge gap in our preparation of citizens for the future. So, what can be done now? This is another whole discussion, but I'll just tick off a couple of things and then we're going to open it up. I think one of the most important things, and I hope that a little bit of today gets the ball rolling for you, is we need to kind of reframe how we think about democracy, that it's imperfect, that people are always going to disagree. There's some value in compromise, and if you look for perfect justice that everybody's going to agree with, you're never going to have, you'll never complete it. Sorry. This whole notion of zero-sum victories, all we have to do is destroy the other side. I mean, that just invites more from the other side when they get into power. Treating fellow citizens as evil is a problem. Our foreign enemies are getting more and more close to us, and we're not paying enough attention to that. So we really need to kind of reframe the importance of keeping our democracy vital now. It's very tempting to get onto Facebook or social media or TikTok and just start screaming at the idiot at the other end. Psychologists have shown, we have lizard brains as well as collaborative brains. The lizard brain often gets the lion's share of our thinking these days because of just social media and other incentives to do so. And that's bad for us. There's a big part of American electorate that basically is relatively moderate, relatively reasonable, and they tend to be more silent than the extremists. And I think it's time for us to start really raising up the people who are reasonable and nonpartisan problem solvers. And I think we just need to do more to get those people into office. Our civic education, there's a lot of revival going on now, which is great, but we need to keep that going even faster. And there are a number of nonprofits that have grown up in the last 5 to 10 years, working on reducing polarization, increasing civic education, focusing on civics as a new topic for colleges and universities. And we should, support these either as volunteers or donations. I donate to several of these things. They're out there. So that's also good news. And then finally, just looking ahead, the reason I wanted to talk about this, as I mentioned at the beginning with United Way folks, is, the United Way patron saint, Alexis de Tocqueville, the Frenchman who visited in the 19th century to study American democracy. He was struck by how much local community action, local organizations are the key to the success of democracy in America. It's local organizations where people create the habit of heart, learn the balance between individual rights and community duties, and look beyond self-interest to the common good. And so my invitation for those of you who want to come back next week is I would love to kind of take the Alexis de Tocqueville filter over today's discussion and say, for those of you who have worked in local communities and are seeing opportunities for what the United Way might do to help build up some of or recover some of our democratic culture, what would that look like? How can we think about community organizations, community work of the sort that United Way has historically done as actually a source of renewed civic education and civic culture for America? So if you dare to come back another week, I'd like to have a discussion about that. Okay, I think that's the end. We've got some time for questions, and love to hear any thoughts, reactions, or questions.
Ivy, do you want to cue us up?
Yep, so I was just going to mention that if anyone had any questions that they wanted to ask out loud, you are more than welcome to just use the raise your hand feature. I believe that there was one in the chat from Barbara and then one from Liz. Of course, if I missed any, you guys are more than welcome to also raise your hands as well, or you can send them in a direct message too.
And Brooke, you might stop sharing now so we can see everybody on the screen.
Great, thank you.
There you are.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll let Liz go ahead first because I think hers is a higher level question.
So my question was, let me get it back here. Some people here in the United States argue that the United States is not a democracy, but is a constitutional republic or something of the sort. I've heard different definitions of republic. And the question is what is the difference between that and a democracy? And is that a valid argument?
Yeah, so that's a fairly detailed, almost scholarly question.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's fine because it's a commonplace. There's actually a section in our book about that. The quick answer is that it was that distinction was made by James Madison, and he looked askance at how the ancient Athenians and Romans operated, and he said, well, those were mob democracies, and what we don't want mob democracies. We want a republic where essentially people are elected, and by the way, we want them to be men of character and people who are, ethically oriented. And so the two problems with that distinction is, first of all, the ancient what we call democracies were not. I mean, they had representation. They had a lot of the things that James Madison didn't know about. So they weren't that different structurally. They were smaller. That's fair enough. But on the flip side, our republic does not require us to elect people of a particular character. Maybe it should. So the distinction, which was sort of embedded in that comment, is kind of false. So we said, look, in real life, you're going to have representatives if you're a very big self-governing entity. There's no way around it, at least without using all sorts of fancy technology, which could happen someday. The bigger problem is just how do we make self-governance work, whether we have representatives or direct democracy. And we think the questions are the same, that it's about this notion of respecting the basic bargain of working together without having a boss. So in our book, we tend to say that is an overwrought distinction that is not really relevant today. And if it was once relevant, we don't think it is today. And for simplicity's sake, we say, let's just treat all of these as basic democracies as we've defined them.
Barbara, I think you had a question in the chat.
Yeah, it's kind of like a comment, or one of the things I found fascinating, Brooke, was the distinction between civic rights and human rights. And it plays into this whole deal about we're evolving and things are changing. But it was a good reminder that what you were saying is governments are responsible for civic rights, and there are limits to what those are, be it the Bill of Rights or whatever. And yet many of the issues that we're debating today, it made me think about, well, healthcare, is that a human right? Shelter, is that a human right versus a civic right? And that those were the, one of the points that you made, I think, in the book was that 39 people of the Constitutional Convention never even voted on it. So this has never been perfect. Could you talk about that a little bit? It sort of was a good reminder to me about how much can we really expect from government? Because there's a limit. There's a civics right limit versus a human rights limit, as much as us in United Way and our caring hearts want it to be human rights as well.
It's a great question, and it's caused a lot of political agitation. So, I think it was after World War II and in the days of the UN being created and whatnot, and Franklin Roosevelt made these speeches about the fundamental freedoms. This whole notion of universal human rights grew up, and it's very powerful and very engaging. But by our view, and again, there are people who disagree violently with what we said in the book, but by our view, democracy is self-governance by people within a certain bounded entity, right? That it's the self-governance of those who are citizens. Now, those citizens may decide that they want to offer some of their resources and time to helping people who are not citizens or to come from other lands or camp out at our borders and whatnot. But like you said, at the end of the day, there are limits to what can be done. And you have to decide how much do we want to prioritize helping people who are non-citizens or far away in other parts of the world versus our own fellow citizens, right? Our own communities. And, you know, practically and realistically through time, there has to be a focus on citizens having the rights that they collectively agree. So I think a lot of the antagonism at the border was, well, how dare you not let these people in because it's their human right to live with dignity. Well, okay, but we don't have room in the United States to have 4 billion people in the world. If everybody said there's open borders, it would be a very different society, even more than it is today. So we have to draw some limit. Internally, a major source of policy debate is just what you said. Is universal healthcare a right? As an example, is universal shelter a right? Where we came out and said, look, there has to be some basic level of welfare. How much above basic you go, that's a citizen decision. You have to make those decisions about what can we afford, right? And so I think that the problem with using the word rights is that rights aren't negotiable normally, right? The only way that rights work is if everybody in the entity facing those demands for rights is willing to support those rights, because somebody has to pay for the rights, right? Somebody has to pay for universal health care. So, it's part of the tension in our democratic, how much is enough? How much is too much? So again, I think within our own society, it's a policy debate. For people who are not members of our society, again, we're allowed to offer resources and help and first aid to people who have come to our shores. But we also have to honor the people who say, like, look, my kid is addicted to fentanyl, and I think that's more important than helping this Salvadoran family that's camped out in Brownsville. That's a fair discussion of how do we allocate our resources and where are our priorities.
Terry, it looks like you might be muted.
Thank you. I was at my tree trimming, got a little loud outside, so I had muted. Looks like we have about 3 minutes left to wrap up. So I think Ivy's going to give us a few last minute instructions, and then Brooke's going to talk a little bit about the next session, which actually will be very different from this one. So we want you to study up and be ready to do most of the talking next time. So Ivy.
Yep, so just a real quick reminder that next section is on April 30th. You guys have the link, and I'll send out the link again in my follow-up email. In the follow-up email, we'll include links to Brooke's website, his book, his email, all of the things. And then at the end of this call, there will be a short survey just to make sure that you guys enjoyed the conversation, if there's anything that we can do to better serve you at future events, and just to get a gauge on what you guys were thinking. And then there was another question in the chat that may have already gotten answered, but just in case, Brooke, if you want to read it over before giving your next little spiel.
Can you read that to me? Because I'm not sure I see it.
Where does the distinction between participatory democracy and representative democracy come into play in all of this? And is it something that might get your rocks out of the ditch?
Well, yeah,
That's probably not a quick
All right,
answer.
discussion for next time.
The one thing I will say, there's a whole section in our book, and there's a whole theme in talking about what we call the challenge of scale. One of the big problems for democracies is there's this core dilemma, which is once you start to make democracy work, inevitably people want to come and join it, right? Either immigrants or, things start to go well, people have children, and they just grow organically. The bigger they get, the harder they are to manage. And the representative model was invented because they could no longer just do it face to face, right? Now, it's been argued that, well, with technology and things like Facebook and whatnot, we could easily have, a lot of direct democracy again. And of course, there's a whole debate about AI. AI is going to allow us to involve millions of people in every decision if we wanted to do that. And then you have this fork in the road. Well, do we want to do that? And that's the James Madison question. How democratic do we want our democracy to be? So it is a threshold question, and I think because of the size of modern democracies and the complexity of modern democracies, it's not going to go away anytime soon. But it's certainly worth continued discussion about.
So Brooke, talk just briefly about the next session and what your expectations are. You said a little bit about that during the presentation, but your job now is to lure everybody into the next session on April the 30th.
Well, lure is maybe the wrong verb. I would love anybody who's willing to come back, because one of the reasons I thought it would be fun to do this is not only that I wanted to share what I'd been working on for a couple of years, and also do some good for spreading the word about rethinking democracy, but I was eager to learn from my former United Way colleagues, because I really do think that the role of community and community development has been largely missing from the discussion about how do we fix our democracy. And I think that, United Way historically was a source of democratic, values and reinforcement. I mean, United Way traded on the notion of, this is what we Americans do. We help each other and provide the greater good for people in need and help each other at the local level. And I would love to just have a conversation. I mean, I will frame it and structure it with a couple of examples and quotes, but I would love to have a conversation, even if it's just 3 or 4 of you. Like, what could United Way do to make a contribution, not just to, providing better education and healthcare in Cincinnati, Ohio, or whatever, but to the values upon which United Way was first raised, and our democracy thrives or does not thrive. And so that's what I would love to talk about next week.
All right, so come back and join us on April the 30th. Sign up for the second session. It's 2 o'clock again. And we'll look forward to the opportunity for discussion. In the meantime, you may not be planning to run out and buy Brooke's book to read in 10 days, but you can access his briefs on Substack if you want to do some more reading about the content from the book before we come to the discussion. And looks interesting. I've got some comments for next time. Kitty Dana has a question. How do we build on the power of freedom that's so central to people in the U.S. yet drive polarization due to different partisan notions? What does freedom mean? How to balance that with our responsibility and accountability to each other?
Yeah, these are great questions. Mary Kay mentioned about bringing the current United Way people into that. That'd be great. Look, I think the United Way is not only an audience, but a resource for some of the questions that were teed up today. And I would love to inspire United Way to join the parade. And there is a parade forming of different organizations that are saying, hey, instead of just yelling at my TikTok on my screen, I want to do something. And there are things to be done at lots of different levels in our American democracy. So that's my hope for the conversation next time.
All right, so we'll look forward to seeing you at the next conversation, the recording. If you have friends that you think would like to be part of the conversation, week after next, feel free to send them the recording so they can have the benefit of this presentation. And Ivy, close us out.